How neuroscience makes God possible. When we think about consciousness, we naturally begin with ourselves. We have a brain. We experience the world. We experience ourselves as a conscious individual. So it is tempting to conclude, consciousness belongs to human brains. But neuroscience has given us a much more interesting picture. The human brain is an extraordinarily complex self-organizing system. Billions of neurons interact continuously, integrating information from the body and environment, generating predictions, updating internal models, storing memories and constructing an ongoing representation of the world and the self. And from this enormous organization comes something remarkable, a conscious individual. But that immediately raises another question. If consciousness can emerge from the organization of many interacting components, why should the human brain necessarily be the largest conscious organization that reality can produce? There is no obvious reason to assume that it is. We already know that complex systems produce higher-level properties. Nature is full of hierarchical organization. Particles form atoms. Atoms form molecules. Molecules form cells. Cells form organisms. Organisms form nervous systems. Nervous systems form conscious beings. At each stage, organization produces properties that aren't obvious from examining an isolated component. A single neuron does not think about the universe. A human brain does. A single human cannot contain the knowledge of civilization. Yet civilization collectively possesses knowledge far beyond any individual. This suggests a powerful principle: complex organization can create higher-order properties and capabilities that do not exist at the level of the individual components. Once we recognize this principle, the human brain need not automatically be regarded as the endpoint. It can instead be regarded as one example of a conscious system at one particular level of organization. Friston, Consciousness through Self-Organization. Professor Carl Friston is a British neuroscientist and one of the leading figures in theoretical neuroscience. His free energy principle, FEP, provides a framework for understanding how self-organizing systems maintain themselves by continuously modeling, predicting and responding to their environment. Friston has extended this framework towards sentience and consciousness, treating self-organizing systems as systems that continually infer and self-evidence their own existence. Carl Friston's free energy principle provides one of the most important modern frameworks for thinking about this. A self-organizing system must continually maintain itself in a changing environment. It must sense. It must predict. It must infer. It must distinguish itself from its surroundings. It must act to maintain its organization. And as these processes become increasingly sophisticated, the system develops increasingly sophisticated models of both its environment and itself. Friston has explicitly connected this framework to sentience, selfhood and consciousness. The significance for our question is enormous. If consciousness is associated with the organization of processes into a self-modeling, self-evidencing system, then consciousness is not necessarily tied to the particular material of a human brain. The relevant question becomes, what kind of organization produces consciousness? And once that becomes the question, we can ask, could another physical system achieve an even greater degree of organization? There is nothing in the basic idea of self-organization that says, stop at the human brain. The brain itself is an example of higher-order organization. Look at what the brain actually does. Billions of neurons interact. Different networks specialize in different functions. Sensory information is integrated. Memory interacts with perception. Emotion interacts with decision-making. Prediction interacts with sensory feedback. The body continuously informs the brain, while the brain continuously regulates the body. Yet the result is not billions of separate experiences. We experience one world and one self. The human conscious mind is therefore already a higher-order organization of enormous numbers of lower-level processes. This is precisely why the possibility of a higher-order consciousness deserves consideration. If many processes lead to a brain which leads to human consciousness, then the question becomes, could many conscious or cognitive systems themselves become components of a larger organized system? If they could, that larger organization could potentially have properties that no individual component possesses. And one of those properties could be a higher-order form of consciousness. Schooler, why stop at the human level? Professor Jonathan Schooler is a psychologist and consciousness researcher at the University of California, Santa Barbara. Together with Justin Riddle, he developed the Nested Observer Windows (NOW) model, which proposes that information processing occurs across multiple nested levels of organization and explores the possibility of hierarchical consciousness. The model explicitly considers whether conscious experience might occur at more than one level within such a hierarchy. This is where Jonathan Schooler's work becomes particularly interesting. His Nested Observer Windows framework explores the possibility that consciousness may be associated with different levels of organization rather than being confined to one singular observer. That provides a conceptual framework for considering consciousness as potentially nested. A system can contain subsystems. Those subsystems can have their own processes and perspectives. Yet they can simultaneously participate in a larger organization. This is already familiar outside neuroscience. A human being is composed of organs. A society is composed of humans. A civilization is composed of societies. Each level has properties that emerge from the organization of the level below. The important question is, could consciousness itself participate in this hierarchy? If the answer is yes, then the human conscious experience may be one level in a much larger hierarchy of possible conscious organization. And why couldn't a greater consciousness precede us? This is where the direction of the argument changes. We normally imagine, matter leads to life, which leads to brains, which leads to consciousness, which leads to humans. But that is only the history we know. Suppose somewhere in the cosmos, or in some earlier physical reality, a conscious system emerged before humanity. Suppose it had billions of years to develop. Suppose its organization became vastly more sophisticated than that of a human brain. Why would it have to wait for humans to appear? It wouldn't. The universe is approximately 13.8 billion years old. Human civilization is extremely recent. There is therefore an enormous temporal gap during which other forms of complexity could, in principle, have emerged. The assumption that we are the first or highest form of conscious organization is not something we have established. It is simply the perspective available to us. Even physics has entertained strange observers. This is where the idea of the Boltzmann brain becomes useful. The Boltzmann brain is a speculative thought experiment arising from statistical mechanics and cosmology. Under certain assumptions about an enormously old universe in thermal equilibrium, extremely improbable fluctuations could, in principle, produce a structure resembling a functioning brain complete with apparent memories and conscious experience. The idea is bizarre. But its importance is not that the Boltzmann brains actually exist. Its importance is that serious cosmological reasoning has entertained the possibility that an observer need not arise through the ordinary evolutionary history that produced us. A conscious observer could, under the right physical assumptions, arise through a radically different route. That expands the conceptual landscape. If physics can seriously ask, could a conscious observer arise spontaneously from an unusual physical fluctuation? Then the broader question, could reality contain forms of consciousness radically different from biological humans? Is certainly not an absurd question. And our greater consciousness hypothesis is actually less strange in one respect. We are not proposing a random fluctuation producing a momentary brain. We are proposing an organized, persistent conscious system that developed over an enormous period but probably outside of our space-time. Consciousness can accumulate knowledge. Now consider what happens to a conscious system when it interacts with its environment. It learns. It remembers. It predicts. It develops increasingly sophisticated models. Humanity demonstrates this at an extraordinary scale. No single human knows everything that humanity knows. Yet humanity collectively possesses knowledge of physics, mathematics, chemistry, biology, astronomy, engineering, medicine, computing, history and countless other domains. Knowledge compounds. One generation inherits the discoveries of another. Technology accelerates the process. And the more knowledge we acquire, the greater our ability to manipulate the physical world becomes. We went from observing stars to producing controlled fusion plasma. We went from observing atoms to manipulating them. We went from communicating locally to creating a planetary information network. We went from simple machines to artificial intelligence. We are already beginning to construct artificial environments capable of producing increasingly convincing experiences. This is what intelligence does. It converts experience into knowledge, knowledge into models, and models into increasingly sophisticated control of the environment. Now imagine this process continuing for billions of years. A conscious entity billions of years ahead of us. Imagine an entity that began developing long before humanity. It has billions of years of accumulated experience, vastly greater memory, vastly greater computational capacity, enormous numbers of interacting subsystems, increasingly sophisticated self-models, continually expanding knowledge, and technologies developed over geological timescales. To such an entity, our current civilization might appear approximately as primitive to us as a Stone Age society appears to modern humanity. And this is where the traditional concept of God begins to look very different. Instead of, God is an inexplicable supernatural being who simply knows everything, we can consider God may be an extraordinarily advanced conscious entity whose knowledge and capabilities developed over an unimaginably long period from our perspective of space-time. It need not be omniscient from the beginning. It could accumulate knowledge. It could learn. It could experience. It could develop. It could become increasingly capable. In other words, God could be an evolved consciousness rather than an inexplicable consciousness. From greater consciousness to creator. Now we reach the next step of our model. Human beings are already beginning to reproduce natural phenomena artificially. We create stars like fusion conditions. We manipulate matter. We engineer biological organisms. We construct simulated environments. We create increasingly sophisticated virtual worlds. These are primitive forms of something potentially much larger, using knowledge of natural law to deliberately construct physical reality. Now imagine a civilization or conscious entity with billions of years of additional technological development. If the laws of physics permit manipulation of matter, energy, quantum fields and eventually spacetime itself, then an enormously advanced intelligence might eventually possess capabilities that appear miraculous to us. It could potentially construct environments vastly beyond anything we can currently imagine. And if it could construct a new spacetime, then from within that spacetime its inhabitants would experience the created reality as their universe. The creator would exist in its own domain. The created universe would have its own spacetime. The two would therefore not need to share the same physical frame of reference. This gives us a possible route from greater consciousness. Accumulated knowledge, which led to an advanced technological capability, which led to creation of a new physical reality, which led to conscious beings within that reality. This is why the God hypothesis is no longer a pink unicorn. We are not beginning by declaring, God exists. We are beginning with things we already encounter in science, self-organization. Emergent properties. Neural integration. Predictive processing. Self-modeling. Sentience. Nested organization. Learning. Memory. Knowledge accumulation. Technological evolution. Artificial environments. Cosmological thought experiments involving unusual observers. And then we ask, what happens if these principles are extended beyond the scale of the human organism and across enormously longer periods of time? Perhaps the answer is nothing. Perhaps there are fundamental limits. But perhaps the answer is a form of consciousness so sophisticated that, from our perspective, it would be indistinguishable from what ancient humanity called God. That is the starting point of our model. We are not asking science to prove God. We are asking whether the frameworks of science leave room for a reality in which consciousness is not the endpoint of human evolution, but one level in a much larger hierarchy of conscious organization. And if such a hierarchy exists, then perhaps we are not at the top of it. Perhaps we are simply one of its lower levels. And perhaps the entity at a level vastly above us is what we have called God.